Here's a tight, suspense-driven hook tailored for HOA drama, designed to grab attention instantly and end on an irresistible cliffhanger. In a quiet cul-de-sac where rules are framed like scripture, a simple parking space turned into a battlefield. Overnight, someone cut a lock, dragged a Jeep into the dark, and left a note that felt more like a threat than a warning. The board called it compliance. The neighbors called it finally taking control. But the homeowner called it what it was: a violation, cold, deliberate, and personal. The cameras caught gloved hands, the chains snapped like a bone, and by sunrise, the Whisper Network had already picked a side. Because when an HOA decides order matters more than respect, every mailbox becomes a witness and every porch light becomes a searchlight. The fines piled up before the first cup of coffee. The letters came with legal phrases and fake politeness, promising remedies that sounded like punishment. And beneath it all, something meaner was moving: quiet agendas, old grudges, and a board member who wanted to make an example out of the one person who wouldn't kneel. This wasn't about a rule anymore. It was about control, about how far a neighbor will go when they think a signature gives them power. So when the homeowner finally pulled the one thread they weren't supposed to touch, it unraveled everything. What happens when the people enforcing the rules are the ones breaking the law? Here's a tightly paced, emotionally engaging setup tailored for an HOA dispute story, introducing a relatable homeowner, a vivid community, and subtle hints of the conflict ahead while keeping momentum high. On weekday mornings, the cul-de-sac moved like clockwork. Sprinklers hissed, garage doors rolled up in a tidy domino, and a row of lunchboxes stacked on a granite counter meant a school bus would groan past in 7 minutes. In this rhythm lived a homeowner who measured days by small victories: fresh mulch down before the first heat wave, a mowed strip of grass along the curb cut just so, a Jeep he kept clean enough to catch the sun on late afternoons. Not a rebel, not a saint, just someone who paid dues, waved at strollers, and stuck meeting notices to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tomato. The neighborhood brochure had promised quiet enjoyment. Most days, it delivered. But quiet has a way of hiding the things that twitch under the surface. The community's rules were printed in a booklet that felt heavier than paper should, fonts that scolded, margins that whispered consequences, yet most of it boiled down to simple habits: trash cans tucked out of sight, lawns shaved short, cars parked with both tires kissing the concrete like an apology. People complied because it kept the peace, and peace, here, looked like a flagstone path edged in rosemary and a porch light that clicked off at 11. Tidy, predictable, and, if attention wandered, the sort of place where power learned to run on autopilot. The board liked to call it standards. Residents called it keeping up. No one called it what it could become when the wrong person decided the rules were a weapon. On Saturdays, the Jeep was an errand list on wheels. Hardware store, dry cleaner, the discount nursery 2 towns over where the rosemary always survived August. He kept a chain on the side gate for the DA. He worked late. No big statement, just caution, the kind learned from a break-in years ago that never made the newsletter. The chain said, "Mine." The yard said, "Respect." The driveway said, "I'll be back before dark." Even the neighbor's cat had a route that avoided the tire tracks. In small ways, the block negotiated with each other, a quiet choreography of courtesy that made life smooth. But choreography can turn rigid when someone starts counting steps with a stopwatch. There were signs, if anyone had been looking. A new face at the bulletin board who rewrote the heading for friendly reminders into mandatory notices. A meeting that ran long because someone wanted to debate whether a wind chime could be classified as auditory clutter. A clipboard appeared at the pool, collecting observations with a smiley face at the top and a signature line at the bottom. None of it made a scene on its own. Together it felt like a draft under a door, cold, constant, hard to locate until papers started to flutter and a plant leaned in the wrong direction. When power shifts, it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just changes the font size. The homeowner kept up anyway. Dues on time, shrubs clipped, holiday lights wrapped neatly back into their box the first weekend of January like clockwork. The HOA emails arrived with the same cadence as utility bills, and he skimmed them the way everyone does, half attentive, assuming goodwill. But then a warning appeared in his inbox about curbside visibility that sounded less like guidance and more like a dare. It mentioned chain obstructions, vehicle line of sight, and appropriate storage within the rear boundary, phrases that sounded official but not quite right. He read it twice, then a third time, feeling that familiar prickling behind the neck that says, "This isn't about safety. It's about someone seeing something they wanted to control." On the block, the small kindnesses continued. Packages tucked behind planters, a text when sprinklers went rogue, shared sugar and borrowed ladders. Yet an edge crept in where the new rules met old habits. A neighbor started taking photos of driveways at dusk. Another complained that trash cans hovered too close to sight lines, as if plastic bins had intentions. Even the newsletter changed tone, less bake sale, more bylaws. It was subtle, the way a smile can hide a clenched jaw. And the homeowner noticed how often he was noticing, how his eyes tracked the clipboard, how his steps slowed near the bulletin board, how his hand lingered on the gate chain as if it were both boundary and bet. The cul-de-sac still glittered in real estate photos, sunsets bouncing off car hoods, dogs pausing at corners like punctuation marks, but longtime residents knew the light can lie. The promise of quiet enjoyment had started to carry conditions. A Jeep in a driveway was fine, unless someone decided it sent the wrong message. A chain on a gate was acceptable, unless it became a symbol. And symbols are dangerous in places where order function, just like religion. The first spark wouldn't be loud. It would be dressed like paperwork. It would arrive at a respectable hour. It would insist it was for everyone's good. And by the time anyone challenged the logic, damage would already be done, and the explanation would be waiting in a template. He planned a simple Sunday. Oil change, swap the air filter, scrub the Jeep's floor mats until the rubber smelled like new. It was the kind of maintenance that made him feel steady, the kind that keeps a life in alignment even when other things drift. He glanced at the chain, at the way it caught the last light. He thought of the email and the phrase, curbside visibility, and the way the words seemed to peer through him instead of past him. The neighborhood hummed, grills igniting, kids arguing about whose turn it was to hide, a basketball punctuating the dusk. Normal, almost aggressively so. But in the normal, a line had been drawn that only one side could see, and if a line exists, eventually, someone will step over it. In the end, the community wasn't defined by its brochure or its bylaws or even its fences. It was defined by what people did when no one else was supposed to be watching. The homeowner had trusted that decency and clarity would carry the day, that if he stayed within the spirit of the rules would protect the spirit of the place. Yet the tone had shifted, the margins tightened, the friendly reminders sharpened. The setup for a fight rarely looks like one from the inside. It looks like cooperation becoming compliance, and compliance becoming control. And control, once it tastes power, never goes back willingly. Here is a high-intensity climax section built for a 21-30-minute narration window, delivering the peak confrontation, an irreversible turning point, and a hard pivot into the resolution. The morning of the hearing started with the kind of weather that never makes the news. Quiet sun, a breeze that carried trimmed grass and chlorine. But inside the clubhouse, the air felt dense, like rules had weight, and people were supposed to feel it. The sign-in sheet waited at a folding table with a plastic pen on a string, and the homeowner printed a name in block letters. Steady, deliberate, the way a person does when everything else wants to push. The board sat behind a banquet table dressed in a two-white cloth. A president with the smile of a referee who likes to throw flags, a treasurer with a ledger like a shield, and a compliance officer who had turned observations into a hobby that felt like a job. This wasn't a conversation. It was a staging. The notices had escalated: warning, fine, second fine, hearing, each wrapped in more legal language than a neighborhood ever needs. But today, the board had invited an audience, and the audience had come. This was not about order, it was about an example. They began with photographs, screenshots of a driveway at 6:01 a.m., a chain on a side gate, a Jeep angled 2 inches over an imaginary line that no one had named out loud until it needed to be punished. The compliance officer spoke like a metronome, clicking through violations that had been invented by interpreting margins as mandates. The homeowner listened, spine straight, feeling the strange double life of a place, how a cul-de-sac became a courtroom when power started dressing like procedure. The treasurer read numbers with the gravity of a sentence. Total due, late fees, administrative costs, lien warning. The audience shifted, the room tilting with each new syllable. It would have been easy to look down, to pay, and make it stop. That's how this works. Small cuts, repeated, until people surrender to the math. But some fights don't ask permission. They demand a choice. And the homeowner had already made it. He placed a folder on the table with the same care he used to coil an extension cord. Neat, controlled, prepared. Inside were pages that didn't look like neighborhood paperwork. Incident reports with timestamps that didn't match the board's observations. A copy of the municipal code section the HOA kept citing, highlighted where the definitions undercut their own argument. Photographs of his own. The clipboard at the pool collecting signatures under observations. The same 2 neighbors appearing in multiple midnight images. The compliance officer's car idling at 1:47 a.m., 2 blocks from his driveway. Then came the letter, the one not addressed to the HOA at all. The room didn't know what it was looking at. Not yet. The president did what presidents do, tried to keep control by pretending control had never been at risk. We'll review submissions at the appropriate time. The homeowner nodded, a movement like a fuse catching light. Appropriate time had arrived. There is a sound people make when they realize a story isn't going the way they predicted. It's not loud, just a change in pressure, a collective inhale that forgets to exhale. The homeowner read. Calm, clean, each word like a rung on a ladder out of something designed to keep him underground. He read from the state statute governing common interest communities, the section on selective enforcement, the clause on due process for fines, the prohibition on entering a pertinent property without consent except in emergencies. He cited the minutes from the last annual meeting where the board had voted to interpret curbside visibility as inclusive of side yard obstructions. And then he read the Attorney General's opinion that said HOAs do not have authority to expand definitions beyond recorded covenants. The treasurer frowned. The compliance officer looked down. The president interrupted, tried to recast the room as informal and neighborly, as if the stack of fines was a bake sale gone long. That's when the homeowner placed the last paper on the table. The letterhead was all the warning the board didn't see coming. A task force crest has a particular gravity when it's printed in black on white. Even people who pretend authority is flexible recognize a seal that isn't theirs. The audience leaned forward. The homeowner did not say where the Jeep had been or why chain cutters had found metal that night. He didn't need to. The letter said enough. Vehicle assigned to a joint task force. Tampering and seizure without warrant constitute interference with an ongoing investigation. Requests for documentation must be directed to counsel. It wasn't grandstanding. It was a mirror. The board saw themselves as they had become, neighbors playing cop with the kind of confidence that only comes from never being challenged. The president tried to take the letter, then remembered he couldn't, not legally, not anymore. A beat of silence made a shape in the room. Then the homeowner spoke a single sentence that moved the story where it had always been heading. You don't have the authority you think you have. The president's flush crept up like a sunburn, slow and inevitable. He pivoted to process, procedure, committees, next steps, any language that could turn danger into a meeting agenda. But the homeowner had brought more than a letter. He had witnesses. A neighbor stood, one of the quiet ones who waters at dusk and waves with 2 fingers from a steering wheel. She had photographs of the compliance officer's midnight drive-bys, timestamps aligned to the officer's own social media posts. Another neighbor described being asked to log observations in exchange for consideration on landscaping variances, a trade that sounded friendly until it didn't. The board's rhythm broke. The treasurer looked at the audience like a ledger that had suddenly learned to speak. The compliance officer stopped correcting words. The room began to behave like something other than a stage. It became evidence. All climaxes need a tick of the clock, something that says now or never, and this one arrived in a puff of certified paper. A courier slid a manila envelope across the table to the president, eyes flicking to the name before leaving as quickly as he'd come. The president opened it because people open envelopes automatically when they are handed one in public. Inside, a notice of complaint filed with the state oversight body for common interest communities, a request for an injunction on enforcement pending investigation, and a demand for preservation of records, emails, texts, surveillance logs, and any materials related to observations collected by non-employee residents. The president tried to set the papers aside with a shrug, but paper has a way of sounding heavier when its words can end a career. The compliance officer reached for a water bottle that wasn't there. The audience shifted again, the weight of the room changing sides. If the board had humility, they could have backed down there, wrapped their decisions in a ribbon labeled misunderstanding, and left with faces intact. Instead, the president doubled down, which is how people lose everything they could have saved. He announced that the board was exercising its right to immediate enforcement, that the Jeep would be removed if necessary for community safety, that the chain represented a hazard to emergency access. He tried to say safety like a spell. The homeowner let him finish, then reached into the folder one last time. Body camera footage doesn't look dramatic on paper. It looks like an index of something larger. But even in stills, truth has texture. There they were, gloved hands, bolt cutters, a board badge on a lanyard that looked official and wasn't. There was a timestamp that matched the homeowner's camera feed. And there, on the compliance officer's wrist, the friendship bracelet the Puda kids had made in July. The audience murmured. The room decided. Confrontations don't always explode. Sometimes they implode, a collapse of certainty that makes louder sound than shouting. The treasurer spoke first, voice thin. We should adjourn. The president said no. The compliance officer tried to explain the hazard, but the explanation tripped over its own feet. A board member in the back, one who had stayed quiet through months of votes, stood and asked the president for the microphone. The president refused. That refusal became the moment that mattered, because everyone recognized it as fear. When leadership fears microphones, the story is done. The quiet board member kept standing. We're out of order, the president said. The homeowner didn't sit. The audience didn't leave. Outside, a siren went by, unrelated and perfectly timed, the universe's habit of scoring scenes it wasn't invited to. Inside, the temperature dropped. It was time. In the days after the vote, the neighborhood moved like a body learning to walk again. Cautious steps, sore muscles, and a balance that felt wobbly but real. The board's power had been scaled back to its proper size, and for the first time in months, the quiet actually sounded like quiet, not surveillance. The clubhouse doors stayed open during office hours with a sign that said, "Records available upon request." That small sentence rebuilt more trust than a dozen newsletters ever had. People who had kept their heads down began to look up. They asked questions. They read what they signed. They treated rules as agreements, not weapons. The aftermath didn't bring fireworks. It brought maintenance, the honest kind that keeps a place livable. That is what resolution looks like when it works. An ending that clears space for ordinary life to resume. Accountability moved in slow, deliberate lines, the way paperwork does when it matters. The city's inquiry into unauthorized entries forced a pause on all enforcement actions tied to observations, a word that had become an alibi. Emails were preserved. Text threads were exported. The compliance officer tendered a resignation letter that called the job misunderstood, a phrase that did not land the way it was intended. The president stepped down formally a week later, citing health and family, and the treasurer agreed to serve in an acting capacity under the oversight of an interim committee made up of 3 residents who had never sat behind the long white table. The shift wasn't cosmetic. It was structural. Transparent agendas, recorded meetings, time-stamped minutes, and a rule that no enforcement could proceed without photo evidence anchored to an actual clause, not an interpretation. Resolution is not just a bow on the story, it is new boundaries that validate what the climax revealed. Neighbors who had been silent found to air voices in practical ways. The midnight photographer apologized to the homeowner in a short, awkward conversation by the mailbox. No speeches, just an admission that pressure can make people do small, cowardly things. A young couple down the block brought over a casserole on a Tuesday, the universal currency of neighborhoods repairing themselves. An older resident volunteered to train the new committee on reading recorded covenants versus newsletters, proof that expertise matters most when it is shared. Trust did not snap back. It thickened slowly, like a sauce on low heat, stirred and checked, never left unattended. The story's denouement was not spectacle but education. People learning the difference between governance and control. That learning is the true aftermath of a healthy resolution. Financially, the mess had a cost, and costs concentrate the mind. The board released a statement acknowledging the legal exposure from unauthorized entry and selective enforcement, paired with a plan to replenish reserves without punishing the community for leadership's mistakes. They canceled a splashy landscaping project and redirected funds into legal compliance training and a third-party audit of past fines. For homeowners, the immediate relief came as credits for improperly assessed fees and the voiding of liens threatened under the old regime. No one cheered. They signed the forms, checked balances, and felt a knot loosen. Money may not heal, but it clarifies. The resolution, by design, must settle accounts, ethical and financial, or the story never truly ends. The homeowner's life recalibrated to something that looked like before, but felt different. The Jeep returned to being a tool and a boundary, not a battleground. Weekends smelled like motor oil and cut grass instead of adrenaline. The gate chain stayed, but its meaning changed. It no longer had to prove a point. He attended the next open meeting and listened more than he spoke, taking notes on ordinary agenda items, pool filter replacements, playground mulch, seasonal lighting, because ordinary is a victory when power has been defanged. The most noticeable change was internal. The low-grade vigilance that had turned nights into watch duty eased off. Resolution is measured as much in heart rate as in policy. In the wider circle, consequences rippled outward in ways that will shape the neighborhood for years. The oversight body issued guidance to all HOAs in the district, clarifying entry authority, evidence standards, and the prohibition of enforcement via neighbor-led surveillance without due process. What had happened on one block became a case study, a cautionary slide deck that will bore and protect countless communities. Vendors who had quietly benefited from unnecessary enforcement, towing, security tours, compliance consultations, found their contracts reviewed with sharper pencils. A culture that had fed on fear now had to survive on service, and it is remarkable how quickly businesses adapt when the rules are enforced fairly. The impact of a good resolution is not loud. It is reproducible. Privately, the homeowner met with a city attorney and declined to pursue civil damages beyond costs. That decision surprised some and relieved others. He explained it simply. The goal was to reset the balance, not scorch the earth. A mediated settlement covered property damage and fees, obtained without drama. The compliance officer faced a separate inquiry about the night with the bolt cutters. That outcome would be handled outside the neighborhood's gaze, where due process belongs. The important part for the story's end was this: the homeowner did not allow righteous anger to harden into vengeance. The best resolutions validate change. They do not poison the well. As the months rolled forward, the neighborhood started telling a new story about itself. Not the shameful one whispered in kitchens about that meeting, but a steadier one about boundaries and respect. Open office hours became routine. A board email list that once sent edicts now answered questions. The older neighbor with the binder turned his tabs into a short workshop for anyone who wanted to understand the recorded covenants. Teens who had watched adults at their worst now watched them fix what was broken. An education no lecture could replace. People began to distinguish between safety and convenience, and the word compliance was retired to the limited work it deserved. Cultural change is the quietest form of impact. It is also the deepest. The homeowner planted rosemary along the flagstone path that fall, a practical hedge with a forgiving scent. He waved more, not less. He showed up. He answered a neighbor's question about camera placements and reminded them to angle lenses away from sidewalks. He declined a seat on the board and joined the audit committee instead, the unglamorous work that prevents drama from needing heroes. That choice mattered. Resolutions often tempt protagonists to become rulers. The wiser path is stewardship. The story's final arc affirmed that the community was safest not in the hands of the loudest, but in systems anyone could read and everyone could trust. And yet, not everything softened. Some neighbors stayed brittle, convinced the board had been bullied. They muttered about overcorrections and witch hunts as if the problem had been tone, not trespass. The new committee resisted the urge to punish dissent. They posted process. They invited disagreement into the light where conspiracy dries up. That is how power ought to behave, confident enough to allow scrutiny, humble enough to correct errors quickly. The resolution held because it was built on procedures, not personalities. Where the climax needed courage, the ending required patience. Over time, the metrics that actually matter began to reflect the change. Fewer violations issued, faster response times to maintenance requests, more volunteers at common area cleanups, and a budget that stopped bleeding into needless enforcement. Real estate listings quietly updated their copy, from strict HOA to well-managed community, a line that says less about control and more about care. The narrative had evolved from spectacle to stewardship, and markets notice what people live. Outcomes, change, and impact, the essential components of a strong resolution, aligned at last. What remained for the homeowner was a final bit of closure. He replaced the chain with a lock that clicked differently, firmer, quieter. Not because he feared a repeat, but because boundaries properly maintained are acts of optimism. He wrote a short note to the neighbor who had testified, a thank you with no flourish, because some debts are paid best in gratitude. He deleted the folder from his desktop labeled HOA Evidence, after filing copies where they belonged. He opened a new folder labeled Garden. Growth, properly named, is an ending and a beginning at once. The neighborhood never forgot the hearing, but memory softened into guidance rather than gossip. New residents were told the story in the same tone as a rule about trash cans, not to shame, but to explain why procedures looked the way they did. What had been a rupture became a foundation. This is the mark of a resolution that validates the story. It turns pain into policy and lesson into habit. It gives future conflicts a map so they don't have to become wars. It teaches people to read seals and signatures, to ask for clauses, to insist that safety means safety, not control. At the first annual meeting under the new structure, folding chairs filled and then ran out. The agenda was ordinary, by design. When the time came for open comments, the homeowner stood only long enough to say this: "What protects us here isn't who sits at the table, it's what the table stands on." He pointed at the stack of bylaws and the binder of recorded covenants. Make this readable. Keep this honest. And if someone says the rules give them power over neighbors, ask them to show the paragraph. It was not stirring rhetoric. It was housekeeping. And housekeeping is how homes stay homes. As the meeting broke, a teenager tugged at a parent's sleeve and asked why everyone clapped for a man who just talked about paper. The parent said, "Because last year the paper was used against us. This year, it protects us." That is the heart of the takeaway. Rules are only as good as the hands they're in and the light they live under. The community had learned to keep both in view. The story, in ending, had fulfilled the promise of a resolution worth remembering. Consistent outcomes, emotional closure, a reinforced theme, and a replicable path forward. In the golden hour of a quiet Sunday, the cul-de-sac looked like a brochure again, but the beauty no longer felt like a mask. The Jeep caught a stripe of limam, jeet. Sprinklers timed their dance. Laughter bounced off garage doors. Ordinary returned, but not as denial. It returned as a prize earned by drawing lines and honoring them. The protagonist did not become a legend. He became a neighbor among neighbors, which is the best kind of legacy an ordinary street can offer. The impact is measured in what no longer needs to be said loudly. The board answers questions, letters use precise language, and nobody cuts chains in the dark. Powerful takeaway. In any community, authority is only as legitimate as its transparency, and safety is only real when it respects consent. Keep the paper honest, keep the process open, and remember that rules should be a fence that protects, not a weapon that controls. When those lines blur, speak up in the room where decisions are made, and don't leave until the light stays on. What is the small boundary right now that deserves to be defended before someone decides it's theirs to redraw?